Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ian Irving. This week, Leicester City won their appeal against a Premier League charge for PSR breaches. Everton and Nottingham Forest have already been punished for their financial rule breaking. And Manchester City, of course, face multiple charges of their own. So, how did Leicester avoid a points deduction, and what does it mean for PSR? Okay, I'm joined by the Athletic senior football news reporter Matt Slater and our lead writer for the Athletic FC newsletter, Phil Hay. Hi gentlemen, I hope you're ready for this. Get our teeth into another financial matter on the Athletic FC podcast. Matt, you've written a hugely detailed article on the Athletic about this, but can you just simplify this story? What exactly has happened with Leicester City and PSR?
Oh, okay. I'll do
Good
my
luck.
best. I mean, we've got plenty of time, so I don't want to overload the first answer. So we're talking about the 2022-23 season. Everyone knows there's always a bit of a lag with these things. And I think we've all got our head around PSR, so I can assume some knowledge because of the old Everton and Nottingham Forest cases. And of course,
you'll need to. We've only got half an hour. So.
Well, but exactly. But also, like fans of EFL clubs, we've been here many times before, right? It's sort of a new phenomenon for Premier League clubs. So we know that PSR, financial fair play, it's a rolling 3-year calculation. It's actually 4 years at the moment, or certainly for 22-23, because the 2 COVID years are treated as one. But we'll talk about the sort of usual 3-year cycle. The threshold in terms of allowable losses is 105 million, 35 million a year. They actually talk about it being adjusted earnings. Now the key bit there is there are things you can deduct. So the positive things that we're trying to encourage clubs to spend on. So your community stuff, any capital investments, so new grounds, new training grounds, the women's team, youth development, that comes off the calculation. So we are still talking about massive losses, though. I think that's often lost in this conversation. We're talking about clubs that are losing lots of money, have lost lots of money. It's a spending control. That's what the leagues are trying to do. So Leicester 22-23 is the year they got relegated. The previous year they'd come 8th. The previous year before that 5th. Everyone knows that they won it in 2016. Won an FA Cup in 2021. And have been that sort of challenger club, that kind of best of the rest type club. In 22-23 they had the 7th biggest budget. That year their wage to turnover ratio was 116%, which meant they were spending £1.16 on wages for every pound they brought in. That's pretty bad. Yeah. Even the previous year it had been 85%, and the year before that. So they were running hot. Had a bad year. Brendan Rodgers got sacked. That cost them a bit of money. They've been running this model for a few years before, really successfully. Basically a big player sale a year. Everyone knows the sort of players that have been through there. And it didn't quite happen this sort of season or so before. They didn't have that big sale. Yes, Fofana and Maddison, we'll probably get into that. Harvey Barnes a little, as well. But they sort of missed a year where they had that big sale. So warning signs were there. I understand, and many in the game have told me that they were pretty close to a PSR breach, or they were sort of, they were on that kind of watch list the season before. The key for them is that they budgeted to sort of still be at the right end of the table. They weren't. Loss of form, recruitment, whatever. They came 18th. Big loss of bonus of prize money. Now they go down, and this is the fun bit, right? So I probably should talk about this in another answer, but they go down, and there's this sort of, which jurisdiction are they in? Are they still a Premier League member, or are they an EFL member? Are they subject to Premier League rules? There's a timing issue here, and we're talking matters of weeks when you stop being a Premier League member, when you start being an EFL member. And while the PSL rules are very similar, they're not identical. And unfortunately, we are talking about 2 regimes, not one. So it is possible, as Leicester City have just proven, to find yourself in a no man's land, in limbo. And that is really what this whole dispute has been around. The facts are pretty straightforward. Like, the timeline's pretty straightforward. Leicester City were in breach. Well, for reasons I'll get into, they can now sort of say we weren't in breach because we didn't actually break the Premier League rules, but they were over the limit quite considerably. As I said, that limit is 105. I think they were basically 129. They were 24.5 over, which is bigger than Everton's breach when they got done the first time and got those, 10 points initially, knocked down to 6. So, a big breach. Premier League charged them. There's been a dispute over jurisdiction. There's been a dispute over, did we actually breach? Because did we actually break your rule? And a first hearing, a first commission went the Premier League's way. Leicester City appealed it. And they've won. They've had a big win. So they've proven you don't have the jurisdiction to do it. But not only do you not have the jurisdiction to do it, we didn't fail your rules. We actually didn't fail your rules. So we didn't breach the 22-23 rules. So it's been a sort of double defeat for the Premier League. Now the EFL are sort of thinking, well, do we try them for 22-23? Can we do it on our rule book? The Premier League is sort of going, oh my God, we've got to rewrite our rules. Can't have that again. Do we actually appeal the appeal? There is an option. It's complicated. The bar is very high. So look, that's what's happened. I know it's complicated. I know there's a lot in there. And there's loads of detail as to how they managed to sort of navigate themselves into this no man's land. But that is it. It is a timing, bad drafting story.
It's remarkable, Phil, isn't it?
It's like every time you hear the abbreviation PSR, another angel in heaven burns to the ground. And none of us are ever going to get away from this. I think the one thing to add to Matt's answer there is the reason why they were able to get away with it. And it was because their accounting period for the last year, 22-23, ran to June the 30th. And the point at which they transferred out of the Premier League, passed on their golden share or their membership, was June the 13th. So they were able to successfully argue legally that by June the 30th, the point at which their accounts should have been analysed, they were no longer a Premier League club, which I think legally is true. As Matt says, there's a really big grey area there. And the appeal board, to be fair, did make the point that in that period between June the 13th and June the 30th, Leicester could have sold players. If they were trying to bring the PSR loss down, then that's what they could have done. That could have brought some money in. It could have meant that they were under the limit when the accounting period ended. But however you look at it, it's a technicality, and it does very much feel like Leicester saying, "Too late, suckers." We're not saying we want over the limit. What we're saying is you couldn't act on us because you didn't. The timing was all wrong. And I mean, I constantly think back with the Premier League to the fact that one of the big problems with PSR is it was never preemptive or proactive. They didn't seem to anticipate in the early 2000s that they were going to have to do something to deal with the fact that there were huge amounts of money coming in, and they got there in the end in 2013 with PSR, but it's taken much longer for it to feel as if the rules were in any way being enforced, and it's taken much longer again for it to feel as if clubs were in any way scared of them or worried about the consequences of them. And what you've got is a governing body who seem to be constantly chasing their tail to find out whether or not these rules are going to stand up. And I think your frustration with this probably depends on what it is that annoys you most about it. Leicester won't be making friends out of this, that's for sure. But you have to say, the bigger picture, once again, when the Premier League's rules have been scrutinised, they have fallen down, and this is not the first example of that.
Matt, just to spell it out then, the exact appeal, the point of appeal has come because Leicester spent the final 2 weeks technically of the June out of the Premier League, but they've spent 2 weeks of the 4-year period, if you include those 2 years for COVID, in the Premier League.
Could I just quickly add to that as well? Does that mean they were actually an EFL club in that 2 week period, Matt, or were they? Or do we not know? They were.
No, they were. Well, they were an EFL. They were a member of the EFL, right? So they were an EFL club. So they were therefore subject to EFL rules, and then this is where there's this breakdown that there's a really obvious solution to this. And to be fair, the EFL have been pushing for this for some time. Let's have one unit. Let's have one regime that deals with this, because clubs move up and down. That is the point. We've seen Nottingham Forest, who went the other way, were prosecuted. So it does seem doubly, triply weird that a club can sort of avoid justice going the other. So there is a solution there. There's several ways you could do it. One, you basically have one unit, one regime, one set of rules, and that's what you could handle it that way. Another way, and I think they're going to look at all these and probably do a little bit of everything, is you just draft the rules better. Because what Leicester City were able to do, and this I don't want to do like a legal lecture, but sometimes legal lectures are quite funny, and this one is quite funny. It made me chuckle anyway. There's a sort of lesson here about the importance of grammar and punctuation. Now, loopholes are, this is the nature of loopholes, right? You sort of go through the rules, and what Leicester City's lawyers were able to do and say, well, look, at the beginning of your rule book, you very closely define what a member of the Premier League is. Capital C, club. Capital L, league. So we're not just talking about any type of football club, we're talking about Premier League clubs. Clubs, capital C, who are members of your league are subject to your rules. So that's at the top of your rule book. Right. You then have another little bit here in your PSR rules about all your timings and chronology. Now, these have been written more recently. That's all fine. But there's another rule here that says all clubs are able to sort of choose their year end within a range, right? And it's the end of May to the end of July. Now, most clubs have gone end of May or end of June. July's a bit too late. We're well into the sort of summer there, aren't we? We're not far from the start of the season. So post-COVID, again, this is perhaps being a bit more complicated than I need to be, but nearly everyone went June 30th because the season sort of knocked on a bit. And that's where kind of most clubs have gone now for their year end, June 30th. But what Leicester City noted there was, well, when you leave, when you get relegated, you are obliged, and you write to us, all the relegated clubs get these letters, to hand over your share, because that's what you get. When you get promoted, you become a shareholder of the Premier League and become subject, capital C, club, member of capital L, league. Not any league, not any club, your league, your rules. So they handed over the share, and you hand it over to a promoted team. It doesn't matter which one, it's all sort of done. Oh, right, well, I'll hand over mine to Luton. And as Phil pointed out, they did it on June 13th. So at that moment, you stop being a capital C club in capital L Premier League, and you stop being subject to their rules. So that's it. That really was the case. It's in your rule book. We stopped being a member of the Premier League when we handed over our transfer, when we handed over our share. Almost everything else is irrelevant. We can go all through the PSR rules. You can talk about what you did in 22, 23, blah, 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 blah. None of that matters because it doesn't apply to us. We weren't subject to your rulebook. So for me, it's quite amusing. This sort of do capital letters matter. We bang on about it, journalists, all the time, and get frustrated about it. In this case, it absolutely mattered because that is the way the rules have been drafted.
You do sound like a frustrated English teacher, I have to say.
I hate rogue capital letters. I hate them.
Don't we all?
Oh, likewise.
But this case absolutely hinged on them.
Therefore, Matt, I have something to ask you, and this is probably not an easy question to answer, but when the Premier League writes its rules or rewrites its rules, who writes them or who rewrites them? Because when they're on paper and they're in theory, they look as if they control the competition, they look as if they bind everybody to this kind of strict list of do's and don'ts. But as soon as clubs get into bother and employ talented or expensive legal teams, it doesn't seem very difficult to ride a coach and horses through them. So who's responsible for these? And is it just a case of poor drafting, or actually is PSR so complicated that it just isn't possible to avoid loopholes?
Well, look, really good question, and the way I'd answer it is there are great lawyers on both sides. Please don't think that Premier League's lawyers are rubbish or they didn't hire really, really good counsel. They did. What we're talking about here is, I think, and you get to it, is the complexity of everything, and things are getting more complicated, and it just becomes hard. And the people that draft the rules are doing their best to think of every eventuality. So do you go really general? If you go too general, everything's up to discretion, and then it becomes a really good lawyer could sort of say, well, that's not really what they meant. And it becomes, you start talking about common sense tests and what would a reasonable person think. And you kind of get into route. So then you write it too tight. If you write it too tight, then you find wiggle room on the edges, and you can find, we couldn't think of that. I think what we've got here, and this is what the appeal panel, which were two very senior, retired 81-year-old appeal court judges and a really good case here, a really good barrister, said, well, look, and there was a sort of kind of philosophical bit in all these rulings. This one was actually quite short; it was 22 pages, because it wasn't really a dispute about the facts. It really was a dispute about, as again, the wording, the drafting. They said, well, look, kind of contracts matter, and yeah, we would. It's okay. I can sort of see how the original commission went, well, that's what they intended, right? Clearly everyone understands what they're trying to do with PSR, and a reasonable person would say Leicester City were, for all words and intents, a Premier League club, right? For the rules to work, a relegated team that has been in the Premier League for 9 seasons, and all those losses were accrued whilst they're a Premier League club, it's a Premier League club. But Leicester City were able to sort of highlight these issues in the drafting, and the appeal panel were like, well, you're right. Leicester City's right. The rules are like a contract between club and league, and I'm afraid to say that the contract has been poorly written. You're going to have to go back and draft them. And it says that, it actually said, I think the drafting has been far from good, or far from perfect, or far from ideal, or something like that. There was a phrase in there that was kind of withering, really. That's the way kind of lawyers talk to each other. So the bigger picture is they've got good lawyers. They sometimes make mistakes. It's because things are complicated. The rule book's constantly evolving. The people who kind of decide the policy are the clubs. All right, so the clubs at their AGMs or their big meetings say, this is what we want you to do. We want you to look at that. We want to close that loophole. But yes, there are clever people out there. And I think that, I suppose the best answer is, these things aren't stress tested. You can never get every loophole. You can never nail down every circumstance. So what you really want to do is you want to sort of legislate gradually, slowly, and you want to stress test things. And I think what we've had over the last 18 months, 2 years with PSR is that this regime was sort of set up 10 years ago, as you noted, but nothing really happened for sort of 7 or 8 years. This stuff wasn't stress tested, and I would argue the Premier League was complacent, a little bit arrogant, that this was an EFL type problem. It wasn't their problem. The money at the top end was so great. These clubs were never going to breach the threshold. And then what have we seen? Loads of clubs breaching. They've all been overspending, I'm afraid. COVID was a shock to the system. They didn't really kind of heed the warning. They kept buying players. They kept spending too much money on wages. And we've had loads of cases of clubs having these problems, and the rules had never been stress tested.
It seems to me that it was, in the end, the Leicester case, spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. And I think we all know that when it comes to an actual legal case, letter of the law always wins. Yep.
That's pretty much it. And there, as I said, there's this sort of philosophical section in there about, intention and what would a reasonable person think the rules were meant to be. And the appeals panel just went, yeah, but you wrote it down. That is what the law, the contract, the rules say. And a member of the league should be able to sort of, otherwise what's the point of rules? If contracts mean nothing, what is the point? So Leicester City are within their rights to say, yeah, but we weren't members of the league anymore. You didn't have jurisdiction over us. We didn't have to send our accounts to you on the 1st of March, and we didn't. And you're right, our PSR breach wasn't crystallised until June 30th, our year end, which was 17 days after we left your jurisdiction. Open and shut. It really was a bit of a mic drop moment.
Okay, well, I think we've set out the case and the appeal pretty well there, and I'm sure people can go and read your article, Matt, if they want more detail on it. But let's start to look at some of the reaction to this ruling. This is the reaction from Leicester and what it exactly means for the club moving forward from our very own Rob Tanner.
Most people around the game expected Leicester City to get a decent points deduction because of the alleged PSR breach. Club as themselves had admitted that they were likely to have breached PSR before, but they were quietly confident they would win this on the wording of the rules and the enforcement of them. But the impact it's had is that whilst that uncertainty was in place, that it impacted their transfer business. In the summer, several of their targets chose to go elsewhere because of the expectation they would be in a relegation battle, and also with a points deduction making it highly likely that they wouldn't be able to retain their Premier League status. That has been lifted, and they can kick on. It will provide a massive boost. I mean, there was a disconnect between a section of the fan base and the hierarchy at the football club over several issues, one of them being the possibility of a points deduction. So perhaps that will now have a unifying effect on the fan base. But also the fact they haven't won a match in the Premier League so far yet this season, although it's early doors. But this feels like a big win for Leicester City. It feels like it could be a big morale boost for Steve Cooper and his men.
Generally speaking, PSR, football finance, it's just become another thing for fans to fight over, hasn't it?
It has, and we were chatting off air, the three of us, and saying, that the reason people take a big interest in PSR is not because they, get out in bed in the morning for creative accountancy. It's because PSR is massively related to transfers, and transfers make the football world go round. If the Premier League could have picked the worst possible summer for this to happen, this is the one, because we've come into this summer on the back of 2 points deductions last season, Everton and Nottingham Forest. And, there are some great graphs, the Athletic have run it several times, about the fact that the points deductions last season were either in excess of or very close to the entire points deductions we've ever seen in the top flight, going back to its formation in the 1800s. It became a burning issue suddenly. And because of that, prior to June the 30th this year, there was that mad scramble among many clubs to get players sold in order to not breach PSR, to keep themselves clear of a points deduction. And a lot of clubs did what they had to do and brought money in. And okay, there was a fair amount of arguing over some of those transfers and the way it was being done and the way in which money seemed to be moving between the same clubs to almost help each other out. But they did what they needed to do. And then, a few weeks down the line from that, month and a half on, 2 months on, you're told, actually, a club who looked like they were in breach and should have had a points deduction, and who would have faced a worse points deduction than Everton and Forest, based purely on the size of the excess loss over the limit, have got away with it. And legally, I think it probably is the right decision, but people like to see the spirit of the law or spirit of the rules applied, even if it can't be. And there will be a lot of bad blood about this. There'll be a lot of bad blood among certain fan bases, but I think within the game as well, within clubs, Premier League clubs, EFL clubs themselves, they'll feel the same, because the Championship, more than any other division, I think, have been massive on PSR for a long time now, and Leicester absolutely blitzed that league last season.
Yeah, in terms of the Premier League's response as well, they said that they thought the appeal board's decision failed to take into account the purpose of the rules. And Phil's right as well, Matt, isn't it? It'd be interesting to see what other clubs actually do make of this, because we've seen Aston Villa and Newcastle, amongst others, this summer trying to operate delicately around deadlines and thresholds, and obviously Everton, Nottingham Forest previously being punished. We'll talk about what's coming for Manchester City at the moment as well a little bit later on in the podcast, but the reaction generally across the game to this ruling is going to be another interesting aspect to this.
Absolutely. Well, look, the Premier League statement that came out was very strong. They're normally quite diplomatic. Well, they are normally quite diplomatic. They're talking to their shareholders. Leicester City are a shareholder. And they said they were very disappointed. They started off saying they're disappointed. Then about 4 paragraphs later, they said, no, we're very disappointed and surprised. And that's genuine. Trying to speak to them on Tuesday evening when the story dropped. I mean, they were genuine shock. They didn't really see this coming. Which you can argue is probably a mistake, because there have been, it comes out in the ruling, letters going backwards and forth. Leicester City's case has been sort of set out for 6-7 months. So there's always a possibility. I mean, any lawyer will tell you, if you go into court, there's a possibility you lose. But I think they were confident after winning that first round, which was a hearing in June. EFL equally disappointed, and we got a statement from them on Wednesday. And they're surprised. So they're looking at it as well. They're going through their rule book. Can we prosecute Leicester? Now they got to the position last season, having tried. They took some some measures as well. They tried to put they basically tried to put Leicester City under special measures going into the January transfer window. They tried to sort of take control of their finances and really kind of force them to sell players. They failed. That was sort of they were reaching too far in terms of their own rule book. They did manage to get Leicester City under a transfer embargo, a registration embargo for the last 2 months of the season. But as Phil says, Leicester go up. They cease to be an EFL club. They cease to be subject to EFL rules. So, again, we go back to that limbo point. The other clubs, they're not. I'd be very surprised if they start speaking publicly, but we've obviously, reached out to them privately, and what we've heard back is similar stuff. How has this happened? This can't be right. Some annoyed with the appeal panel, some annoyed with the Premier League, some annoyed with everyone, some annoyed with the world. The frustration, I think, is the sort of the noun of the day.
Yeah, and it's felt across the league, isn't it? It begs the question, Phil, as well. Will other clubs look to take advantage of this situation? Because if they do, you can see that people will spend money to stay in the Premier League, and if they go down, it won't matter anyway.
That's definitely true. Matt was talking at the top of the show about the ways in which the Premier League can avoid this again. And I guess there are two really easy ways of doing that. And well, not necessarily easy, but quick ways of doing that. One would be to say that if you're in the Premier League for any considerable length of time in your accounting period, then it doesn't matter when the accounting period ends, you're still subject to the rules. And obviously if you can introduce that rule and clubs sign up to it, then that kind of works. I guess as well the Premier League would have the option of withholding the transfer of a club's golden share until the end of an accounting period to make sure that that they are happy with the accounts. But I think Matt said that the accounting period can, and I think I'm right in saying, can run on to the end of July if you wanted to. And you cannot have a situation where a club are effectively gaining membership of the Premier League a week or 2 weeks before it's about to start. The process as it is at the moment of it transferring over in mid-June seems really sensible, in terms of timing. The loophole will have to be closed. I don't think this can be allowed to happen again. And I think the fact that it's happened once is really humiliating for the Premier League. I just quickly wanted to ask of Matt whether or not you think the changes that are coming with PSR, the move away from acceptable losses to the kind of almost like salary cap, the percentage of income turnover that you're allowed to spend on squad cost effectively, which will come in a couple of years' time. Is that going to be easier to manage? And do you think that's going to eradicate some of this? Or is it just going to be the same problem in a different form?
We shall see. I mean, that's certainly the hope, right? UEFA have been doing it. Does that mean it's been stress tested at UEFA level? Probably not, because it's been phased in. The idea there is that we're trying to head to 70% of your revenue you can spend on your squads, right? And that includes wages, your amortized transfer spend, which is just how you account for transfers, but wages also for coaches and support staff. So it's a sort of a nice holistic, the product on the pitch type metric, and it's a percentage of how much you bring in the door. So it's a soft, as you say, it's a soft salary cap. I think the hope is that is more straightforward. It's a better tool because it's sort of more aligned with each club as opposed to sort of a hard, limit 105, which people are upset with that it hasn't moved because of inflation, blah blah blah. But you still need a chronology. You still need definitions of what clubs are. You still need, the contractual language. And you're right, that all I think now post Leicester has to be massively looked at again. And look, I'm confident. I'm not breaking any confidences here to say that they are. They were already looking at it. So there's some good news there. I think the one I'm thinking of is, you could define club and member and all that sort of stuff more broadly and more subtly to sort of kind of, iron out the smart aleck lawyers that will find the loopholes. Or I just think you can take a more overall view. EFL and Premier League have just got to work much more closely on this, and a single unit to me would make sense. And hey presto, a regulator is coming. Should this be something that the regulator looks at, pushes, steers, takes on themselves, all to be discussed, right? So I think this two sets of rules, that just doesn't work. If you have a pyramid, clubs move up and down, what are you doing?
Right, well the question is what happens next? Matt and Phil, you've both introduced different ideas as we've gone along the podcast already about exactly what should happen moving forward for PSR and the Premier League. I guess we'll talk about Manchester City in a moment, because that is the next major case that's coming in this regard. But Matt, just generally, not to introduce another acronym and make it even more confusing, but what damage does this do to the PR of PSR for the Premier League and for football? Sorry.
Does PSR have good PR? I mean, does it?
I was going to say, with its wild popularity as it stands, yeah.
I'm trying to think of a more sort of damaged brand than PSR.
VAR.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's a really good example. Those two vie for sort of the least popular three-letter acronyms in the world. Well, actually, I might be stretching it there, but anyway, they're not very popular, are they?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's bad. It's bad. Next question. I think Phil used the word humiliation. It was humiliating. It is.
Do you agree, Phil?
Yeah, because your rules, and I think more to the point, it's not as if this is an isolated defeat in a run of glorious victories for the Premier League. They wanted Everton to have a bigger points deduction than they did. It didn't happen. It was hard work getting to that point, and likewise with Nottingham Forest. I do think, I know we're sort of delaying talking about it slightly, but I do think the Manchester City case is now critical to the Premier League.
Let's talk about it now, Phil.
Yeah, because
let's talk about it now.
Because the rules are under fire anyway, and as I say, there does seem to be this trend that if people enlist the right lawyers with the right brains and attack it in the right way, that there's change to be had out of the Premier League's rules, no doubt at all about that. And I don't think at any stage there is ever going to be a case with more riding on it, with bigger parties involved than these 115 charges against Manchester City. And it's not to say that City should lose this case, because that will be decided in the hearing. But I think if they win it, and the Premier League are seen again to be unable to, because the Premier League clearly think they're guilty. The Premier League clearly believe that Manchester City have breached financial rules multiple times in ways that have helped them massively. If they're wrong, or if they can't stand that up, then again, and I think it starts to feed back into rules about other things like PSR. Do they know what they're doing, and do they have this under control? And at the moment, it doesn't really look like it.
Matt?
Right. Getting more serious now.
Leaning forward.
We're going to lean forward.
The glasses are going to come down in a moment.
Yeah, well, look, let's just be straight here. There is no real direct comparison between the Leicester City case and the Manchester City case. Yes, I completely understand, and I've seen it on social media and elsewhere, people trying to draw comparisons. And okay, the fact that Leicester City have proven there are holes in the rule book is concerning, and the fact that we've had another example of a league, and this has happened to the EFL over their umpteen cases, Derby County, Sheffield Wednesday. They've had defeats along the way. It is not unusual. It's not that rare and unique for a league to lose a case when it's been trying to apply its rule book. So that's not unusual. But they are very, very different cases. Very different cases. This was a PSR case. It was a sort of jurisdiction case. We've discussed that already. The Manchester City case that is why it's so serious. That is why it's taken so long. That is why it's so sensitive. Okay, it does, I think, highlight the fact that great lawyers can find holes and gaps, and there are weaknesses in the system. Yes, but to me that wasn't really new. I sort of knew that. This particular Leicester City case, yeah, it's shocking and blah blah blah. But the fact that there are problems, that all leagues, all governing bodies have issues, have weaknesses, vulnerabilities, is not to me a big headline. The Man City case is massive. I mean, geez, it couldn't be bigger. It really couldn't be bigger. But it's not a pure. I know there's some PSR charges in there, but it's not a pure PSR case, and it is very different to Leicester City. I just want to caution against drawing too many lessons from this Leicester City case. That's kind of the general point I'm making.
Yeah, but it does underline its importance, Matt, doesn't it? Like you've said, in terms of getting it right. This is for the Premier League, and Phil, again, it's going to be another issue that other clubs are going to watch extremely closely, because their faith needs to be rebuilt in this as well, like fans' faith does.
It polarises everybody, doesn't it? You will have people in Leicester City fans who will look at this decision in favour of their club and say it's absolutely right. It's what the documents say, it's what the rules say. Legally, it's correct. You'll have a swathe of people who will say, yeah, but if you've been fair and if you've been reasonable and if you're applying that terrible phrase, the spirit of the rules, then it doesn't seem particularly fair, does it? And I think what you're inevitably going to have with the Manchester City case is whichever way it goes, there's going to be a huge amount of upset. There's going to be either a huge amount of upset at the Manchester City end, there's going to be a huge amount of upset among those people who want to see them punished if they're not, or, and this, I don't know whether this is more likely, but we end up falling in that terrible no man's land in the middle where it doesn't really sort itself out properly one way or the other, and nobody's quite sure who's won and where it's gone, and nobody is satisfied. It's hard to see how the City case is going to end in sunshine, if you know what I mean. And I guess it's probably fair to say that it isn't. But this is the thing now, you've got everybody at such extremes of wanting to see punishment when it's, when in certain circumstances, not wanting to see punishment in others. And it's a mess, and it just seems to be a constant distraction from the actual product, which is the game.
Just to bring it back then to finish, Matt, on Leicester, is this the end of this situation, or are we ready for the next instalment already almost?
Right. Not necessarily the end. Might be the end. I'll explain. The Premier League have already got on the record. They're going to look at it. There is this option. It's called Section X. It's basically another sort of arbitration hearing. To trigger it, it's quite a high bar. It really, very specific circumstances. Basically, the previous lot just got the law wrong, and we're going to argue about the law again. I'm not sure they'll do it. The EFL are looking. I know they're minded to have a go. So not necessarily the end. That's 22-23. Leicester City also have 23-24 issues. Now, the assumption was selling Dewsbury Hall, the money they got from Maresca, so basically Chelsea giving them 40 million, was going to make it good. We don't know that yet. And part of the assumption was, and this is a little bit technical, so the way the EFL operates PSR is if you've already breached it before, so that kind of Everton situation, we don't do double jeopardy. We're not going to sort of hammer you again. So what Leicester thought they were looking at, what everyone thought was going to happen with the Leicester case, was that they were going to be done for 22-23. So you can take those relevant years out of the equation. So the EFL would only be looking at what happened in 23-24 when they were a EFL club. And they'd be looking at, and the EFL limits are smaller. It's 39 over 3 years. It's 13 million a year. So that's a problem. But like I said, Leicester had that late flurry of cash. There was this idea that would be okay. But because Leicester City haven't been done, or unlikely to be done for 22-23, those previous years are not wiped out. So the 23-24 calculation for Leicester City is massive loss in, get the numbers right here, 21-22, massive loss in 22-23, something like 180 million over those years, and then and then whatever happened last season. So that's the bit. There's bits we don't know, but I think sort of inadvertently, not that Leicester would moan because they've still had a big win, they could be in 23-24 trouble. I know it was very technical with the years, but it's that just the assumption was that they were going to be done for 22-23, which would wipe out a couple of their bad losses. Yeah. But they're now back in the calculation.
Yeah, it makes sense.
All right.
And I'm ready for that podcast already.
Yeah, I was going to say same time, same place next year.
Yeah.
Do you know one thing we haven't discussed and I haven't asked, Matt, is what do you think Leicester would have been deducted if this had stuck?
Right.
Well,
no, good question. Really good question. Well, so what's happened over last season where we started off with that really big Premier League wanted 12 points for Everton first time round, ended up on 10, appeal got it down to 6, we had the Forest cases. The Everton appeal has kind of set the benchmark. It was a really useful process. I know it was really painful for Everton and I have a lot of sympathy. But where we sort of got to was, again, fixing a Premier League problem. I would argue they were arrogant. about it. The EFL did have a schedule, did have a formula for how much over equals this many points. The Premier League didn't bother. They left it all up to the discretion of this panel. I think thinking that it would never happen, and then suddenly it happened a lot. So they got themselves in a bit of a mess. If you take the Everton appeal, and they ended up with 6, that is the starting point for Leicester. Starting point. But I've already said they were a little bit more over. Right? So at least 6. And then there's points for coming off or going on for aggravating or mitigating factors. And we've had, if you remember when we talked about both Everton and Forest, there was a lot of conversation around mitigation. Forest were way over, by the way. I think they were 30 million or something over. Now, they had a slightly different threshold because 2 of their years were EFL years, so they had a much smaller threshold. But they were way over. I think they were 34 over. But anyway, their mitigation was around the Brennan Johnson stuff and the fact they'd come from the EFL and that they'd cooperated and da-da-da-da-da. Leicester were going to get no mitigation. They were only going to get aggravating factors. They had been late. They had refused Premier League inquiries. They threatened to sue the Premier League. I can't think of more aggravation that they caused. So I was thinking, and others weren't pushing back. In fact, others were saying similar, 9 to 10 points. That's what we were talking about.
That's relegation, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah, well, yeah, yes. Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would have been a very, very serious deduction, certainly, and a massive challenge for them to overcome that, to avoid the relegation. Right, I'm going to go for a further sit down and a cup of tea, I think, after that. But Matt, Phil, absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for explaining every aspect of that. I hope you enjoyed it. Like we said as well, there is the article that Matt has written on Leicester City's appeal. It's on The Athletic now. Tons of details in there. But for the minute, thank you for listening. Adam Leventhal is back tomorrow, and we'll speak to you soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.
If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.